As most of you know, our Rotary Club has been out for blood since past President Sten Chrissy and VP Membership Retention Vicki Oxley started collaborating back in the fall of last year. Thanks to our members, we are among the top contributors to this important initiative during the pandemic. To introduce our main speaker for today's program, I'm pleased to bring Seattle 4 member and past president, Sue Nixon, to the podium. Sue, if you please.
Thank you, Jeff. This is my first time at the Rotary Digital Podium. First of all, thank you all and your team for an amazing year. I can't believe that it is the end of March and you've done an awesome job. And Don Kraft, you give me chills every time you talk. I am so proud to just be in and alongside you in this Rotary Club and all of those amazing people you mentioned. Thank you. Some of you know that my personal story includes my life being saved multiple times by incredibly generous humans. Learning a few years back that blood donation makes individuals saving one another's lives a daily happening got my attention. It inspired me to join Bloodworks mission full-time in 2017, and I have very good company. Beside me are names of a robust team of Seattle 4 Rotarians who have been part of Bloodworks' work in the community over time. Board members, influencers, advocates, blood drive sponsors, greeters, and individual blood donors. This list does not include financial donors who might want to remain anonymous. And at the district level, our very own Kathy Gibson is joined by Alan Mary, Beth Tesh, Jean Withers, and our Seattle Rotaract Club, who have driven Rotary engagement beyond Seattle 4. I've no doubt missed some names and just want to appreciate and thank you all for your support of our community in this way. And now to honor, or it is my honor to introduce Curt Bailey. In his first 20 months as the new president and CEO of Bloodworks, Curt has transformed our 76-year-old organization. His creativity and decisive action during what we all know has been a distinctly challenging time ensured that we met mission in partnership with our community by sustaining a safe and reliable blood supply all throughout the pandemic, while also elevating Bloodworks' health and sustainability as an organization. No doubt this has been made possible by his impressive mix of skills and attributes. Curt is former captain and U.S. Marine Corps helicopter pilot. He brings 20 years in healthcare management consulting, recently as partner at McKinsey & Company. And he's a thought leader published in leading journals such as Harvard Business Review. Overlay all of this with Curt's love for snowboarding. He thrives on leaning into the steep unknown with a good dose of adrenaline and speed. I will tell you that he has served Bloodworks and our community beautifully, and he also makes it a very fun ride. So as a member of his team, I admire Curt's distinctly humble and generous style, clever thinking, laser sharp focus, and how he has inspired us to be bold and joyful with challenge and change. Over to you, Curt.
Well, thank you, Sue, for the very, very kind words and the introduction. And thank you to everybody for the introduction to join you today. I very much appreciated the inspirational beginning with the scene and the singing from the Naval Academy, and then Nick's inspiration, and then Don, your inspirational life as a Rotarian. So I'll share a little bit about Bloodworks. I'll share a little bit about the journey we were on over the past year, and then a little bit of pretty frank talk about what are big challenges we confront today in the blood supply, both in the Pacific Northwest as well as across the nation. In advance, though, I did want to say thank you to what I understand to be nearly 150 Rotarians in the district who have donated blood last year. This year, 67 persons have donated blood so far. We would love to see that number get much higher, and hope that Rotary will consider not just 150 donations a year like last year, but rather 150 donations a quarter of blood as an objective. But it's not just giving blood, you all give time. And we innovated something called a pop-up donor center, which I'll talk about a bit later. And Rotarians have been volunteers, and volunteers are a very important part of how we welcome our donors in and make for a wonderful experience at the Seattle Aquarium, and as I understand it, soon to be the Seattle Opera. So thank you to all of you for all you have done to secure a safe and reliable blood supply, and all that you will do to keep it so. Thank you. Well, with that, Carolyn, can we run the video? It's short, it's just a couple of minutes, but it might give you a little background on what we do at Bloodworks.
Every year, 5 million Americans need a blood transfusion to survive an injury, surgery, or illness. About 1 in 7 people entering a hospital will need blood. That's one person every 2 seconds who needs a transfusion to live. And blood can only come from another person, which means individuals in our community claiming their connection to one another and stepping up with courage and generosity. Bloodworks Northwest is the sole provider of blood for 95% of hospitals in our region. It is our mission to be ready so that local patients get the blood they need when they need it. 1/3 of all donated blood goes to children and adults with cancer, and it's blood that gives answers, so women and girls with bleeding disorders can lead normal lives. A patient may need more than 50 units after a car accident. Postpartum bleeding often requires multiple units of blood to save a life after bringing new life into the world. We supported 667 transplants last year, each one a window of hope, reliant on the readiness of donated blood. Whether from a pandemic, a natural disaster, an unexplained tragedy, or a planned operation, our community needs blood every day. It takes all of us, again and again, because the need never stops. This is our time to join together as first responders, caring for our friends and neighbors through the gift of blood. The health of our community depends on it. Your voice and influence can help make giving blood and saving lives a critical public habit. Please spread the word. Join us. Become a life changer so that we stand ready for every patient, every day, together.
All right, thank you, Carolyn. Can we cue up the first slide? All right. I see on this slide many of the supporters of our life-saving work, and Chief Scoggins, for example, who I imagine nearly all of you know, featured prominently at the top. Perhaps there's other Rotarians in there behind their masks, I'm not sure. But thanks again to all of you who have supported our work, and in particular our work over the past year. You know, as we all know, Seattle was the epicenter for the pandemic. And when the pandemic hit, principally in the first week of July in the Seattle area, the blood supply very nearly collapsed. And the reason for that was we typically collect 2/3 of our blood through mobile blood drives at schools and churches and businesses. And in that first week of March last year, the schools started closing, the businesses started sending employees home, and our mobile drives began to cancel. And it looked like within about a week, we would be collecting only 1/3 the amount of blood that the community needed. And so that was an extremely scary moment for us. And we acted pretty quickly, but more importantly, the community responded beautifully. And we put the call out asking donors to now come in to our donor centers to donate blood to protect the blood supply and ensure that the patients who need it every day would receive it. And the community rose up to that challenge, and we collected enough blood. And in fact, we maintained sufficient blood stocks for the entirety of the first year of the pandemic. And every single day of the first year of the pandemic, the community ensured that we had above target levels of inventory. And that's actually a really extraordinary accomplishment, which you are all a part of. So our thanks and our gratitude and really our admiration to all that the community has done and every person who made that possible. The recovery of the blood supply in March was in part because we did two things. Aside from the cleaning protocols and the social distancing and all the other safety measures that made it so there was not a single known transmission of SARS-CoV-2 and a COVID infection in our workplace. Importantly, we went to this thing called a pop-up donor center. And it was a way for us to replace all of those mobile blood drives, or at least some of them, that we couldn't do any longer, with multi-day blood collection activity in really prominent venues. And the first one was at T-Mobile Park. And at T-Mobile Park, we collected blood for 10 weeks. And it was a great opportunity for folks who wanted to donate, who also thought going to a ballpark and getting into that part of the ballpark that people like me don't usually get to see was pretty cool. And then we did it again. And we did it at the Museum of Flight. We did it at the Moore Theater, the Paramount, Seattle Opera, the Aquarium, down in Portland, and other places where these venues that are an important part of our civic culture that were dark could be bright again and could serve a second use. And that was how we recovered a lot of the blood that we couldn't collect in our traditional drives at schools and at businesses. The second thing we did is we went to appointment only. I know that I can't get out of my dentist without being told, hey, book your next appointment. And we've gone to that same idea too. So now everyone must book an appointment. That's really for safety reasons, to ensure that our collection sites don't get congested with a lot of donors at one time. But then we ask folks to rebook their appointment and come back at a known time. And that has worked really, really well for us. It makes it so that we're able to collect a much steadier amount of blood every day. There's fewer swings. And we're on appeal less than we've ever been in the past, meaning we go out to the community and say, hey, we're running short, far less than we used to, in part because the community responded well, and in part because we've leveled the collections of blood day in, day out. So those were two important innovations, and we intend to keep with those, even as the pandemic subsides. The final thing that was a big change for us is convalescent plasma. As many of you may be aware, there's history as well as some early evidence that if you take the antibodies resident in plasma of a person who has recovered from COVID-19 and you transfuse those into a person who is fighting the virus, that person, that patient who's fighting, may have better outcomes. That program really represented one of the very few treatments that the world had and still has, lamentably, against a COVID-19 infection. And so we ramped that program here in the Pacific Northwest about as fast as anyone did in the world. And over 6,000 units were collected and either transfused or put into the national stockpile. And at its peak, the national stockpile overall has contributed over 500,000 units that have been transfused to patients all over the country. And we were part of that. All of you, all of us at Bloodworks made that possible. And while the evidence is mixed on the efficacy of that plasma, personally, I believe it saves some lives. And that's an amazing thing. So maybe next slide, Carolyn, if you don't mind. So before diving into some data, I'll give you a little bit of context. The US blood collection infrastructure was really a product of the Second World War. And there was concern about having blood available for transfusion, both in Europe and in the Pacific Theater, and also concerned that there could be attacks on the West Coast. And so blood centers arose up and down the West Coast as elsewhere in the nation. And so the Puget Sound Blood Center was founded back in 1944. And well, I should say it was founded as the King County Blood Center, and then became Puget Sound Blood Center, and now it's Bloodworks. And it's an organization that has been one and the same throughout that history. And all over the country, we have blood centers that collect blood on behalf of their communities. And it's really a pretty amazing part of our healthcare infrastructure that so many people come together in order to selflessly donate a part of themselves, and that blood within a day or two can get to a patient who needs it. An exceptional example of what, as a society, we can organize to accomplish for the health of our fellows. It is at a point where it's getting weaker, it's becoming more frail, and largely it has to do with the data shown here on this slide. So each of the waves, as we call them, represent a snapshot in that particular year, like 2020, 2010, or 2000. And for every donation of blood in our region, what was the number of donations and what was the age of the donor? And you can kind of see that there's this wave of donors, for the most part, the greatest generation and the baby boomers, that moved from 2000, 2010, and 2020, and have been the majority of the blood supply, which is really remarkable because they're also donating blood far later in their lives than previous generations did, which is, I find, really inspirational. The difficulty comes in Generation X and to a lesser extent in the millennials and Generation Z. And that's where we see a pretty marked fall off. And we're not replacing the donors from the greatest generation and the baby boomers with donors from my generation and from others to follow, at least not at the sufficient amounts. So it's getting harder and harder to ensure there's enough donors coming in the door every day. And it seems to be related to this fracture in the way in which we communicated or taught those who come after us the importance of donating blood. And so what we have yet to solve at Bloodworks, and indeed this chart could be made for any blood center in the country, how do we help others in our community who haven't learned the value, the gift of donation, which is a gift to the giver as much as it is to the receiver? How do we help them learn the joy in that and become a part of the community that saves lives every day? We don't have this solved, and this is an area where I suspect we need substantial partnership with institutions like Rotary and other institutions in society. Next slide. So I misspoke a little bit. The blood collection infrastructure actually didn't work well for everybody, and it probably never did. The blood collection, so everyone here probably knows, you have a blood type, A, B, O, positive or negative. Actually, blood is a lot more varied than that. And there are far more differences on the surface of a red blood cell than just what's represented with the ABO blood groups. And sometimes those differences matter. And those differences, for the most part, are a product of evolution and genetics. And so they are a function of our ethnicity. So the blood of a person of one ethnicity will have characteristics that are different than the blood of a person of another ethnicity. And medically, that's really important because sometimes if they don't match perfectly, the patient will attack the transfused blood. So that's very dangerous and it can be fatal. Well, our donor base here in the Pacific Northwest, and therefore our blood supply in the Pacific Northwest, heavily skews toward Caucasian. And we do not have as many donors proportional to population from other ethnic groups. And that's actually quite dangerous because we have patients from those ethnic groups that need blood. There's a disease called sickle cell anemia. It is most prevalent in the African-American population in the United States, and it's a dreadful disease. And a patient recently presented, and because that patient had been transfused so often, and because their blood had some unique characteristics, their body had built up antibodies to other types of blood. And that person went into a condition where not only was their body attacking any blood given to that patient, but it started to attack that patient's own blood. The patient's still alive, but it was a near-run thing. And we only had 2 units in the Pacific Northwest that were an exact match for that patient. There were no units available in the rest of the country. And the 2 donors in the Pacific Northwest whose blood matched perfectly had recently donated the 2 units we had in inventory, and they couldn't donate again. So it's just an example of where, very poignantly, a fairly young patient isn't able to be transfused for a disease that requires transfusion. And the reason is because we just don't have enough diversity in the donor base and in the blood that we keep stored. And that's a major health equity failure in our society, in my opinion. Next slide, please. So the other thing that you may not know about Bloodworks is we do a lot of research. We tend to be funded by the National Institutes of Health. We also do some research, particularly related to trauma for the Department of Defense. And then Bloodworks funds some independent research as well. In another area where the playing field's not level, we do research into something. It's women with inherited bleeding disorders. So there are bleeding disorders that are genetic, and as a result, a patient won't clot properly, and they'll bleed both externally, for example, excessive bleeding due to dental surgery, or they bleed internally, for example, into their joints. And that's characteristic of hemophilia, and it's characteristic of von Willebrand's disease. And traditionally, hemophilia was considered male only, and that only males could have hemophilia. That's not true, actually. Women are carriers for hemophilia, and women also can express the symptoms of hemophilia despite the fact they're not supposed to be able to get the disease. Similarly, women can contract von Willebrand's disease and other bleeding disorders. And what this does is 2 things, one acute and one chronic. The acute is it's very dangerous if they have a bleeding event, like a pregnancy. And at birth, it's a very dangerous postpartum hemorrhage, potential for postpartum hemorrhage, where the mom could suffer or it could be fatal. And that would be true too if the mom had a trauma or needed a transplant, something that required surgery, where the extent of their bleeding disorder, previously undiagnosed, could result in excessive bleeding and danger to the woman's health or death. That's on the acute side. On the chronic side, which I find in some ways more poignant, women with bleeding disorders, they'll have nosebleeds, they'll have very heavy periods. As adolescents, that blood loss will reduce their iron levels, and that in turn impairs cognitive development. And they'll go through life where dental surgery is now problematic because of excessive bleeding, and they'll never be diagnosed because the belief is women can't have bleeding disorders. But in fact, they do. And now they can't necessarily go to school because of very heavy menstrual bleeding. And it affects their ability to get a job and hold that job. And we haven't done the work to fully understand how to find the genetic test that identifies those women so we can begin treatment. And so the vast majority of women in Washington State don't get treatment. And our estimates are that there's 75,000 women with a bleeding disorder whose lives are significantly affected because of it. We have a patient that we treated at Bloodworks, our physicians who specialize in this, and they still can't figure out why she bleeds. Our testing isn't sophisticated enough, but they found a cocktail that works and keeps her bleeding under control. And this woman was joyful, and last week she expressed her joy to her doctor by saying, I finally feel like we have this under control. And so I was able to go out and buy a white comforter for my bed. And that's the kind of effect it has on women when we have these sorts of inequities in our healthcare system that we haven't invested in order to address. So Bloodworks has lots of work to do. We have work to ensure a safe and reliable blood supply, particularly as we go forward with challenges in the general donation rates, as well as to ensure it's a diverse donor base to serve our patients who increasingly are from a diverse background. And we have work to do on research because after all, if we're going to do all this blood collection and distribution, we really should know a whole lot more about it. And not knowing enough about it has real human consequence. So I'll stop there, and questions, I'd be delighted to answer. I suspect there's some in the chat. I'm not always so facile at navigating the chat and verbal questions, so I might need a little help with this.
Curt, we've got you covered. That's
Okay.
my job. Otherwise, that is not job security for me. So we've got a couple of good questions, which I just lost because I moved my cursor. I've got a quick question while I look for this. How does one go from flying a helicopter to running a blood bank?
Really just serendipity. You know, I had chosen to stop my management consulting career and was thinking about different options. I was living here in Seattle during that period as a consultant, and so I wanted to stay here with my family. And it was just serendipity that Bloodworks, my predecessor, was retiring. He had earned a well-earned retirement, and so he was moving on. And I got a chance to talk to the board chair about it. And what I loved about the notion is that it's service. It is an institution that endeavors to save lives every day, so the stakes are high. And there's a series of things we need to solve for, both the ones I mentioned, as well as other issues related to our long-term financial stability and how we make sure that the blood supply in the Pacific Northwest is resilient. And so I just thought it was a great challenge. And as I met the people, I also was delighted by the prospect of working with them. And Sue exemplifies, of course, the amazing colleagues that I have at Bloodworks every day. So that's how I landed here. And the first 2 years have gone by pretty darn fast with lots of learning and lots of growth for me along the way.
All right, well, then congratulations. All right, question. I recently tried giving platelets rather than whole blood. I'm curious as to what type of donation is most useful to you.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. Well, it kind of varies. So every donation is valuable. We waste almost no blood. And so blood gets used. And it is certainly true that type O blood is more flexible, if you will, because type O blood, those donors, that blood can be transfused into type A and type B and type AB recipients. And so it's a little bit more flexible. And so when we can't type a donor, or a hospital treating a patient can't type a patient, I should say, then having type O blood from a donor on hand allows a transfusion to happen while you're waiting for the blood type to come back on the patient. So it's just a little bit more flexible, and that's great. But we need all types of blood, and I don't mean to imply that there isn't always a need. There's always a need. The thing with platelets is we can only store platelets for 5 to 7 days, as opposed to about 45 days for red blood cells. So it's actually much, much more difficult to keep enough platelets on hand because they go bad. And literally they sort of go bad because they're kept warm. They can't be kept cold. So the platelet donations for those who are for those who are willing to do it, it is really a tough thing for us to keep in stock. And we very much appreciate those who sign up to donate and make it a habit to donate those platelets.
All right. During the mad cow situation in the UK several years ago, US citizens were not allowed to donate blood. Are they now?
So there are still limitations on that. And the issue, as I understand it as a non-scientist, and I'm not a doctor, is that the theoretical possibility exists for mad cow to be resident in a person who lived in that part of the world at that time period. And in theory, it could be passed through your blood donation and infect a patient that is transfused with your donated blood. In theory, my understanding is that there is no known case of that happening. I don't know if that restriction will be removed. All blood banks in the United States are subject to stringent regulations by the federal government. The Food and Drug Administration is our regulating body, and they set the rules, and right now they do restrict it.
All right. So speaking of restrictions, are there age limits on donations? I tried to donate one time during a blood drive and was told I was too old.
I don't think so. No.
I want to get to the bottom of that. That's age discrimination.
That sounds like it. Come on in. Whoever
on in.
Whoever wants to donate blood, we can make that happen.
Got to be no such thing as too old. All right. How long after you have been in the part? How long after you've been in a different part of the world that has malaria do you have to wait until you give blood? Does it matter if you are anti-malarial medicine while there?
To the second question, no, it doesn't matter. To the first question, it's now 3 months. So the FDA made a bunch of changes during the pandemic where the deferral periods used to be 12 months for a whole slew of things like travel to a malarial region, but now it's down to 3 months.
Okay. Then I've got a backup, I've got a follow-up question to that. I gave blood a little while ago, and you mentioned this in your topic. If I gave, do you ping me to say, hey, it's been 50 X days, come on back in?
Yeah, we sure do.
All right, then I got to look at my email better. All right, what can be done to allow gay and lesbian individuals to donate blood?
Yeah, okay, so this is a really difficult one. For us, and I'll clarify the question a little bit. The FDA requires us to ask certain questions of donors, and based on the donor's response to those questions, we're not allowed to collect their donation. So that's a federal regulation that we must comply with. This question gets to the FDA's required question around men who have sex with men. And it asks the donor, if they're male, are they a man who has sex with another man? And if the answer is yes, then they can't donate. And we have real problems with that. And to be blunt, I think that's discriminatory. I think that we would never have such a sweeping discriminatory language or regulation for an ethnicity or a geography or a gender. And I personally don't appreciate being forced to be complicitous in a discriminatory regulation. I don't appreciate that. There's not a whole lot we can do at Bloodworks other than say, we think this is really wrong-headed. We do believe that there are legitimate infection risks from HIV. We believe that there's particular behaviors, some that are or aren't gender related, some that are or aren't related to sexual preference, and you can screen for those. But it gets at very specific behaviors, not identity. And we have been pushing the FDA to rethink that and are frustrated with the slow pace and the lack of progress. And I communicated that with as much force as I could to our congressional leaders 2 weeks ago.
All right, so to follow up on something along those lines, sort of, you and this attaches to one of the things you mentioned in your speech. With our sickle cell example, with your sickle cell example, you are suggesting that there are biological differences in blood from Black people. This suggestion perpetuates the falsehoods that there are biological and physical differences between Black people and white people, which has led to continued inequities and poor outcomes for Black patients in our health system. If there are differences in blood types that are specific to treating sickle cell, what that would be good to understand?
There are differences, and it has to do with the antigens that reside not just on the surface of red cells, but in other parts of the body, including on platelets. And if a patient is transfused with blood that has antigens that they don't have, then they may create antibodies. And that's what give rise, that's why, by the way, you can't transfuse type A with type B blood, because you already have the antibodies to type B, and that's fatal. So that's an example of where we all have difference in the biochemistry of our blood. So if a patient is frequently transfused and there's not a precise match, they're increasingly more likely to build up those antibodies to the foreign blood. And then when they get transfused again, they may attack that foreign blood. And when your body attacks foreign blood, it's a very dangerous event in the body, and it can be fatal. And that's what happened in the example that I shared, unfortunately. So we endeavor to keep units of rare blood who have unusual antigens. And don't quote me on this, but my understanding is that there's over 300 different blood types actually. But most of the time, for most of us, only ABO matters. But for those people where all the other types, so to speak, do matter, we try to keep rare units on hand to have a perfect match. And we actually have kind of a vault, it looks like, where we keep them frozen in our main building. But we don't have enough, and we don't have the diversity we need. And our diversity of blood supply really needs to match the diversity of our community. And as I mentioned previously, our blood donor base skews heavily Caucasian. And so we just don't have enough diversity in the donors in order to have enough diversity in the supply.
Okay, I get it. Curt, we've run out of time. If you've got more time with us, maybe I could push you towards the chat area because there are so many great questions. If you don't mind answering some of them, that would be fantastic because I literally can't get to them all. But thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for bringing this conversation to our eardrums, and thanks to everyone in Rotary who continues to give blood. Sue, you rock. Curt, thank you so much.